Hello, I'm Marc Sidwell, and welcome to Between the Lines, a new show about books and the people they inspire. Joining me today to discuss 5 books that matter to him is the author and journalist Michael Collins. Michael has also worked as a TV producer and a scriptwriter, and he recently made a heresies documentary for the New Culture Forum, White Privilege, the Demonization of the White Working Class. He's also written an acclaimed biography of the white working class, The Likes of Us. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today. You've brought in a fantastic pile of books, and I can't wait to discuss them with you and why these matter to you. But let's start by talking about how the world of books entered your life. Were your parents readers? Did you have books around when you were young?
No, not at all. I mean, it was pop music, film and telly for me. If there were books in the home, there were boxing books, football books. My dad had a couple of books about the Krays and Jack the Ripper, and that's the best it got. I really didn't start reading until I was 20, because as I said, it was really pop music for me. I can't even remember really attempting books at school. There were 2 books in the school library that struck me, one of which is Up the Junction, and the other one was a book called Go Ask Alice by Anonymous, which was the diary of a drug addict.
Yeah.
And it was that kind of thing that drew your attention, because that was about drugs. Up the Junction, there was an abortion story in it. So suddenly the kids were interested in that, and that's how I got this Up the Junction, really. And this is the paperback. This is the original, and why it was important to me and why I remember it is because it was a London-based novel. Nell Dunn, the writer, was grand. She was the daughter of a baronet, and she left the Chelsea set. She moved across the river, sort of slumming it in Battersea, and then she wrote these vignettes of life among the working classes of Battersea between 1959 and the early 60s. And it's brilliant stuff, because she's doing it as an observer. She's not grafting it onto any kind of political agenda, and so she's just reporting in a really simple, economical way the lives of these people in their kind of voices as well, which really struck something. It struck me in a big way, that, because you'd seen that on television, but you suddenly find it in a book. You recognise these voices, you recognise the language, and you recognise the characters. I mean, the one thing I'd say about The Junction is it is big on the abortions and the old,
Backstreet abortions and sort of being flushed down the toilet is the famous story.
Exactly.
From it.
And the husbands were always, the women were kind of put upon. The husbands were always bruisers, and there was another side to the working class. There was a kind of more of a decorum, and it wasn't that dramatic, which is kind of absent from this in a way. But I think it's a really important book, and it's just, as I said, it's an important book because she does it in quite a dispassionate way. She does it as an observer, just reporting on these lives at that particular time, and also, the factory, the market, the pub. Because they're a younger generation, and it's the beginning of the 60s, they're beginning to really discover pop music and fashion. There's not really money, but they're connecting to a more a culture that is a wider experience than maybe their parents had. So yeah, Up the Junction, really, it's still a good book. And also, Ken Loach did the BBC play Up the Junction, and I interviewed him way back in the 90s for a documentary about Carol White, who played one of the characters. And he said when they made it, they were literally just pulling pages out of the book. There was no script.
Well, there's so much dialogue in it, right?
Yeah,
really,
and it was
like
just these. There was no plot. It was just these little, outtakes from these lives. And her next book, Up Poor Cow, which Loach did on film, again with Carol White, it was actually filmed in this estate, these tenements, condemned tenements called the Palatinate, which was literally 2 streets from where I grew up. Right. So there's this strange connection with me and these books, and they've stayed with me for a long time. And still quite an important little document, I think, Up the Junction.
So. Do you think it was coloured by the fact that it was someone so grand that had to write?
An
extraordinary thing to have done, to come from that sort of Chelsea Earl background to do it, but she could only perhaps see things in one way, or?
Well, I think there's I wrote about this in The Likes of Us. There's this history of these people. They're kind of almost like missionaries. They go in, they're grand, they go in and they look for the darker side, or if it's about politics, they'll try and find, you know, the worst kind of example of working class existence and attach it to some kind of political agenda. But I think in some ways, I don't know that many. I don't know many working class writers that produce books like this. I mean, there probably are, and I think, but there's always been this tradition of the grander, you know, upper class or upper middle class people going in and suddenly documenting this. And what I think is good, as I said, is she does it in such a way that the vernacular, you know, the way she picks up on the phrases, the London phrases. Henry Green did something way back. I mean, he did this book called Living, when he tried to write the whole book in the vernacular of the characters. This was in, I can't think where it was. It was I don't think it was the North, but it wasn't London. But it's really hard to read. So I think what is really good, she does it so economically that she's just, there's no narrator. It's almost like she's written so simply and reported it so simply. And they're really great. They're just these self-contained little vignettes of just factory life, you know, these girls going to the pub, the things they experience. So yeah, up to Junction.
Sort of brings it into the sort of the cultural world where people are paying attention to this and something that you could recognise, but that actually people start to think this was real, and it's like part of life that's just being ignored in some ways for a long time.
Well, and also it's a kind of it predates a lot of the BBC stuff, like the Wednesday play and all those things, which this whole kitchen sink, you know, approach became much more evident, you know, on screen. She was friends, I think, with John Brackley, the painter that did those things like still life, you know, and it had fish and chips and a wardrobe or something. And I think she does the equivalent here. These are just fantastic little sketches of working class London life. And I think it's interesting now because, you know, class is still an issue. It's kind of almost been redefined. There's a number of people I noticed on Twitter that are suddenly just saying that class isn't where you start or who your parents were, or, you know, what they did for a living. It's almost like they're trying to redefine it, but they are the ones that have gone to the private school, and, you know what I mean? It's like, it's this sort of mad thing that's going on. I was going to say that's the other thing with, I think, these books. They are, I wouldn't say they're my favourite books entirely, but they are important because I think they touch on themes and issues and trends that are still so current now, even though these are ancient books. I mean, this is 1963, so up the Junction.
Well, let's move on to a very different part of the sort of English class system with Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. This is a very well-loved copy you brought in here. Classic modernist novel.
This is incredible. It's 40 years old, this copy, and you can see in it, it's the old Granada paperback, and I've got the bits where I've marked it because I've tried to work out over the years what she was actually doing. I really like slim books. I like slim books. I like, you know, modernist writers. Beckett, Eliot, and Virginia Woolf are the go-to writers for me. I don't really like the big plot-driven books at all.
Was this in your 20s? You were something like this when you were starting to read?
Yeah, you sort of got one of the first novels. I really liked female writers at the time. Doris Lessing, I was a huge fan of. I think Woolf's really interesting because her, and before her, Catherine Mansfield and Dorothy Richardson, they were trying to write a different kind of novel that became this stream of consciousness type of a book where it isn't without plot, and it's just about this is the life in the day of one woman going around, a very grand woman married to a conservative minister, living in Westminster. It's just the day in her life. She goes to the florist. She's visited by an ex-lover, and it's just Woolf had really, she'd got her style by this point. I think Jacob's Room and some of the shorter fiction, there were hints at it, but this is where she really finds her feet. And so it's just the thoughts that go through her life, through the day, the memories that come back, and the story, the incidental things happen, written in such a poetic, beautiful, brilliant way that it's an extraordinary way of it changed novel writing, but I think it's an extraordinary way of telling a really simple story to keep you gripped without any plot or anything dramatic. She literally buys flowers, no bombs go off, no one's kidnapped.
Yeah. But it's haunted too by that sort of sense of melancholy. This is England, high society after the First World War. She's looking back to that childhood she has, just sort of an idyll, but there's this other young man, Septimus, who's been in the trenches and is traumatized deeply by that. You get the sense that it's a beautiful world, but there's sort of dark things under the surface, or a world that's been lost somewhere.
Well, that's the Septimus thing is interesting because, of course, there's a suicide in it. But I think the thing about that is the characters I don't really like. They're grand. They're posh, they're rich, and she's got a very leisurely lifestyle. I almost wish there was someone that had written in the way that Wolfe wrote about these characters. Right. I wish there was someone that could write about the working people in this way, where it's quite poetic, and it just gives them a lot more than as we said, the abortions and the dodgy husbands. But I think it's style. I think it's Virginia Woolf's style that really interests me. And I think.
Did you take anything from it? Because you've sort of been a storyteller in your own career. Is it sort of something you've learned from?
Only the way the economy of it, because she will actually give you 2 sentences, and that sums up a life, or that sums up a passing character. And you return to it, and you always, even a slim book like this, you return to it, and you just find things that you didn't know they were there, just because one line gives a clue to someone's history or someone's story. I think the other reason this is relevant now is because, as I said, these female writers were doing a different. I mean, Ulysses is the life in a day, but there's so much fat on it. This is just so slimmed down, and I think she, Catherine Mansfield, Dorothy Richardson, they were doing it. They had a different sort of take. It was considered a sort of feminine fiction. And we're having this now because so many female writers, are prominent now, and we've had this thing in recent years where the novel is apparently changed, and female writers are leading this by writing a autofiction, and novels that are not particularly led by plot, and they're much more personal. But I find they're just the equivalent of the Hampstead novel, because a lot of these women are writers that they're writing about. They usually live in a house that's being refurbished, and that's the story.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think if you're going to go for that, if you're going to go for the, the plotless, female fiction, if you're going to call it that, I'd go to Wolfe. I really would. I wouldn't bother with all the modern stuff.
Yeah, and of course, today there's a lot of talk about, novels have to sort of be about your own experience, or people are being kept in their boxes about what they can write about, or even what, to some extent, they're supposed to be able to understand if they read about it. So it's interesting, as you say, that
she was doing that.
Well, but for you, I meant as a reader, sort of working class background and a man, but the power of this book speaking to you across all the years and the class gap and
that's because of the style, I think, more than. Another thing is it does. Both the Up the Junction and Mrs. Dalloway at very different times. They tell a very good story of London at different times as well. So that's the backdrop, and that's the other thing that's interesting to me. They walk through similar streets.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to someone who's American and from a very different area and era, because we're now going to the 1970s, I guess, with Tom Wolfe and his essays, his extraordinary new journalism essays in Mauve Gloves and Madmen, which is, I think, probably came out about the time I was born.
I was about to say 1976.
There you go.
Yeah, I think it was 1976. This particular essay, The Me Decade, I really like the new journalism of the 60s. And when you say about books that have influenced you or writers that have influenced me, I loved the scope of journalism around about the mid-70s in America, particularly New York Magazine. You can't quite believe when you see New York Magazine now that they used to have people like Tom Wolfe, Jimmy Breslin. Jimmy Breslin was on the broadsheets, but they. It
was a golden age for magazines of all kinds in the 1970s. Extraordinary work coming out.
And the way they'd been given the opportunity to write these essays, where they'd bring in all the techniques of fiction, to tell a completely different story. Yeah, because
Tom Wolfe's style is very, and of course then he went on to write some fabulous novels.
Oh yeah,
but they're very literary, even in the essays.
I actually prefer the journalism of Wolfe, because I think I do with Orwell as well. I think it's just the scope and the nerve. Because the other thing that's interesting, it's like with Eliot, or I really like it when you have these people that are quite conservative thinkers or have quite a conservative outlook, but their approach to their subject is quite avant-garde.
Yeah.
And so Wolfe has this kind of very southern, dandified kind of look going on, and he's, he never really completely gives away what his politics are, but you can sort of hazard a guess. But his style is so completely wild and mad and out there.
So tell us a bit about this particular essay.
I think
this is the Me
Decade and the Great Awakening.
Yeah.
I think his essays again chime with so many things now, but this was a very interesting one because he basically talks about after the war, he says money came into America in such a way that there was no longer such a thing. You couldn't really talk in terms of the proletariat because the lower middle classes had pulled in the working class, and they were kind of quite despised by, I suppose, the educated, wealthy liberals who, because they wore the wrong clothes, they had the wrong taste, and they wanted to move to the suburbs. They didn't want to live in worker housing or Bauhaus type housing. And so he talks very much about how this creates this idea of a me generation, that let's talk about me. And he defines a lower middle class now that have chosen individualism rather than communitarianism, and they've moved to the suburbs. Their parents have moved to retirement homes, whereas all the kind of the casualties from the 60s, so the politicos, all those that followed the sort of pseudo-spiritual cults, they're now in the 70s slightly lost. So they've moved to primal therapy or S meetings, where they're actually trying to talk about themselves via the way of their problems or their issues. And it begins, at these meetings he talks about they're trying to deal with things to do with whatever happened to them as a kid or their sexuality, whatever. But he said it gets to such an extreme thing that it begins with this woman who just talked about her hemorrhoids. And I think this is the third Great Awakening. I think we're now in the fourth Great Awakening, because if you look at this and where we are now, on the business of, instead of let's talk about me, we've got someone like Oprah Winfrey talking about your truth, where everything is about how you perceive something, whatever you project onto something or how you interpret it, that is the authentic, that is the one take.
Yeah. Well, I was fascinated too, because I was rereading this obviously for this conversation, and how contemporary it felt to me. This is literally something that was published when I was born, but I read it now and I think this feels very familiar. This world of people being fascinated with themselves and the Meghan Markle on Oprah Winfrey and so forth. But of course, the fact that it's not just for the princesses and everybody, but it's also sort of down in lower middle class life or ordinary life.
That is interesting.
Everyone
that is really interesting, because of course he says this was a pastime or a hobby for the aristocrats, and by this time it's worked its way down. And of course this has happened now. You look at Markle and she's a classic example. But not just that. If you talk about the issue of pronouns, people defining themselves by one particular thing. That's what I love about Wolfe. Wolfe says this line, she says, we are never simply one thing. But we live in a time now where everyone wants to attach themselves to being one specific thing, whether it's about people's pronouns or whether it's the way the remit of mental health has widened. So even if you're not part of a protected group, you can probably get day release in being bipolar or personality disorder, what it was called. And I think that is so much where we are now. We are in a kind of version of the Me Decade now. And interesting enough, that you could say that arguably money has poured into society, into the UK over the last 30 years, in the way it probably did in America in those post-war years.
And we've got the snobbery in the same way about something like Brexit, about the sort of listen to Andrew Adonis or someone going on about sort of the miserable poor voted for.
That is, I find that really interesting, because whenever I've written about the working class, and I hate going on about it because I do feel like a boy band whoring around their one hit sometimes with my book. But what does interest me is I think the missed opportunity with British literature in the post-war years is the absence of the suburban novel. I'm never actually writing about that. All that material of the work that he refers to, Wolfe refers to, the working class that moved out of the capital, that moved out to the city, You know, it's my subject. It interests me so much, and no one covers it except they denigrate it because they don't know about it. And I remember Martin Amis, I think it was Martin Amis, once said, "No one has written about the suburbs because they'd have to live there." And it's that snobbery. It's because
someone will go to Battersea because it's trendy and down and difficult. They won't
and it's a bit like we need you almost needed someone, even if it was as a Nell Dunn, you needed someone to go to the donut ring of London and beyond and report on those lives and those experiences of the people that had moved out.
Well, I mean, it brings to mind the sitcom Keeping Up Appearances, which of course is about someone who's trying to escape a sort of embarrassing sort of background, but is also being sort of sneered at for the way that she tries to sort of put on these middle class airs that she can't really live up to, bucket, bouquet and all of that.
I think she's kind of old school. If you look at something like, what's that, Gavin and Stacey.
Yeah, right.
It's that idea. I mean, I don't think that particularly does it well, but I mean, I just think that is, you know, Sheena Mackay did it to some extent in Essex, I think, but with an Essex novel. But I think it's a missed opportunity. You know, there's this, because this is a majority of the people in this country, and that's
we were talking about worlds that don't get their stories told.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I think that's true. I think that is a real missed opportunity because no one's actually seriously looked at that within literature. And it's as I was saying about this auto-fiction, you know, we've had the Hampstead novel, we've now got this auto-fiction which covers similar territory, you know, but, there's a great opportunity there.
People step out beyond their boundaries. Well, let's zoom back in time and place to Charles Masterman's The Condition of England. This is, 1909, a Liberal MP writing about working class conditions in industrial London and the problems of that.
Yeah.
Why does this speak to you, or why does this still speak to now? This is an oldish book now, probably the oldest book you've got here.
This is a terrible cover. I think this is a print-on-demand one. I lost my original. But again, this is non-fiction, but Masterman, really interesting. He was Liberal minister, politically probably somewhere between Sidney Webb and Samuel Smiles, so he was kind of... he was for the role of the state was an important thing, but he was very much for defending sort of self-determination and self-help to some degree. So he moved to London and he moved to Camberwell and he went to work as at the settlement, Cambridge settlement, and lived in among the locals in that end of the 19th century in Camberwell, and all this. He began to document this in essays and books, and then the most familiar one, the most famous one, was The Condition of England, which he wrote at the time he was in a Liberal minister in that government that brought in all the reforms.
How did this come into your life?
Well, bizarrely, I worked for a think tank in the 2000s and set up a supplementary school at Cambridge House where Masterman worked, and I knew he'd worked there, and that was the reason I chose it. And I got hooked just before that because I knew the territory, because I knew Camberwell, I knew that area very well. Why this is a really interesting book and a really important book is because he began the first line of it is what will the future make of the present, and he looks at this. Two things. He looks at a city. He's obsessed with the city, especially the capital. The modern city that's been formed in the wake of industrialisation, and the city tribe that is peculiar to that new modern city, and how they live and what they do, and that the idea that there's a white Israeli thing of two nations, you know. Right. But what he does with this book is he says, what is England and where does it reside? And why he asked that question at that time is because he says at one time you knew where England was. It was pastoral, it was the countryside, it was agriculture. It's now been so urbanised. Where do we now find England? It's the question that all would ask years later. And so he addresses this by taking apart English society, and he separates it into the conquerors, the multitude, and the suburbans, the suburbanites or whatever, and various. So he addresses it in terms of various tribes. Now within there, he says the suburbans are the old school, the high simplificator, you know.
He possibly doesn't have so much time for them. I got the feeling.
Well, he's got the snobbery about he's got the snobbery about the villas that the work as Wells did. He's got that snobbery about the people that moved to the walking suburbs or the prairie suburbs as they became, and he's. So he's got that sort of almost liberal intellectual snobbery about him. And he says at one point, the upper classes on the rich look down on the suburbans, and the suburbans fear the working class because they fear socialism. So he's kind of quite snobby about the what's happening with the people that burgeoning suburbia that these people are embracing at that time. But he also talks about the idea of a working class that are beginning to. They've not got. It's before universal suffrage, obviously, but they're a voice that's swelling that will begin to want to be heard. And he mentions this in relation to, obviously, he knew the web, so he talks in terms of trade unionism, the nascent Labour Party, but again, he does it in a way, as I said about the Nell Dunn book, that idea of doing it as an observer. So he's documenting it, he's reporting it, but he's not entirely putting his opinion or his take on it. He's trying to, and I think that's what makes it interesting. And it very much chimes with now, because I mean we've gone through a change, technological change. We're going through a change in terms of asking, in wake of Brexit, in the wake of all the shenanigans of the SNP, the very idea of England is being talked about again, and what is England, and where does it reside?
Where does it reside?
So these questions are still so relevant, and I think it's a really undervalued book. I think it should be on the curriculum.
I think it's also worth saying too, this might sound like perhaps the driest of the books on the table, but it's often quite poetic. There's some lovely imagery. It's sort of the idea of industrial society as this dark windmill turning under starless skies.
Oh, that's a great line. Yeah.
Extraordinary.
No, he's a really interesting writer, but an interesting politician as well. I mean, he was an MP in the East End initially. But the other thing he does is he's a bit of a poet. I mean, he brings in some fantastic references, and very much something of the time. He was very much in with, as I said, the Webbs, Wells, all those characters around him at the time that we're familiar with now. I'm amazed that this book is never mentioned,
Well, it's one of those books that falls between stools, isn't it? People want to think about the past and socialism, or the past and, I don't know, free market liberalism, or free trade in the late 19th century. But a liberal person like that, who's somewhere between the two, working on starting national insurance, concerned about the poor, but not actually wanting to take away their autonomy at the same time.
Exactly, and that's exactly
where he was. It's a very
was.
Complicated place.
Well, again, I think this is the same thing that I like about the Nell Dunn thing. I mean, he actually moved into the area. He was, he was a graduate, and he'd come down from Cambridge. He was a Christian, and so it was the time of Charles Booth surveys, the Salvation Army, William Booth. So he was actually living in this place called Albany Buildings. When my family were living just streets away again, bizarrely. But I'd love that idea of him again. If he was the only voice that was going to go in and record that or document that, and that was to inspire him to bring this book, then I'd rather him than no one else. You know what I mean? So, so again, with the Nell Dunn thing, I think these figures are important because they did leave us with something that documents a particular time that, again, of people that didn't have a voice within literature.
Well, let's turn for the final book, to a very different voice, but it's also a voice that needed to be heard. This is Ralph Ellison's classic Invisible Man. Now, this is about the African-American experience in sort of mid-20th century America. But why does that speak to you, or where did you come across
this? Contradicts everything I've just said, because this is a really big book, and it took him 7 years to write. It's a great cover, actually. I first came across this again about 40 odd years ago, and I started looking at just before the Brixton riots happened, and all the rest of it, and then I sort of put it down. I was a bit, I sort of was a bit overwhelmed, and so I came back to it a few years ago and finished it. And I think Ellison's a really interesting. I don't think it's a great book. I just think it's a really important book because, when you think about Black American writers, men in particular, of that period, like you say, the middle of the 20th century, you think of Baldwin, and James Baldwin has got that sort of sixter hipster thing going. Richard Wright, much more graphic, much more political, probably more, it's kind of almost writing in a more documentary style. Ellison wrote this book, which is just simply about this young, educated black American man who he never names, but he writes in the first person, and everything that he goes through. I think the problem is he's always acted upon this character because he's almost like Candide or a kind of Kafka character.
Yeah, so he's sort of picaresque where he goes through all these adventures and you see these situations
that happen to him. But what is interesting is in the process. And again, Ellison does that thing which I love, and I've said these other in these other books. He's the dispassionate observer, even though he's the narrator. He's not imposing an agenda. He's just reporting the things that are happening.
It's not a social protest novel in the way that people think. It's not Uncle Tom's Cabin saying we've got to end slavery.
And that's been the criticism. Yeah. That's why I said Richard Wright or James Baldwin get more a kind of respect in a way because they think this is a criticism of Ellison. He didn't do that. He wasn't political enough with it, even though him and Wright were both
and sometimes quite nuanced, right? I mean, you get the sort of almost satire of the black protester movements,
exactly,
or at least it observes their self-interest as much as it does the racism in the society.
And not just them. This is why I find it a really interesting book, because they become like these archetypes. Because he's got the characters in there. He's got the sort of black nationalist character who is like pre-Black Panther, like the BLM type characters now. He's got the posh, white, rich woman that is toying around with left-wing politics, that objectifies the black man and wants to even indulge in a rape fantasy. You've got the kind of eyes-rolling Rochester black characters that have to play the game. Yeah. And he comes across all these and these particular characters that sometimes they almost take on a sort of Dickensian filter, because I think that's where I think the book's very, very melodramatic. There's a big coincidence, isn't it? I don't think... it is one of those big books with a plot, and he spent a long time writing it. But I think for me, what's important is the way he documents characters and events that are still with us now. The relationship with the police, the riots, the looting that follows the riots. Everything is with us now, and we've witnessed it in the last year or so. Especially in America with Black Lives Matter, which seemed like pure theatre in relation to when he was writing, a very complex time, a bleak time, when people were, laying their lives on the line because, they wanted change, they had conviction, which completely contradicts, I think, which is completely opposite of where we are now after so many decades and so much change. And so I think a lot of people could go back to this novel and probably see that these characters that are with us now, whether it's race baiters or the grifters that are around us now, and find them within this.
It reminded me a bit too of one of Tom Wolfe's novels, A Bonfire of the Vanities, which has some of that in...
Absolutely, in Sherman McCoy.
Yeah, there you go. But it's fascinating, these resonances in these books, which are really from decades ago, but they give us these new lenses to see things that are going on right now.
And I think that's probably more true about Ellison than anyone else. I mean, I think if you look at where we've been with all the BLM stuff over the last year or so, and you think it's all here, decades earlier in a different time, and you are just, you're playing a game, you're going through this whole farce, that seems kind of madness in relation to these characters and these events at this particular time when it was a very different society. Some of these battles have been won, and you're just prolonging them or recreating them. Basically.
Recreating them. Well, fantastic. Thank you. That's been great to run through those books. That's almost all we have time for today, but thank you to my guest, Michael Collins, for sharing these books with us. You can find his book, The Likes of Us, on Amazon and elsewhere, and you can watch his documentary, White Privilege, The Demonization of the White Working Class, right here on YouTube. Do please click below to subscribe if you haven't already, and as ever, let us know what you think in the comments, and perhaps share the books that matter to you as well. Finally, though, just to close out, Michael's agreed to read us a quote from one of the books, from Masterman, I think.
Yeah, Condition of England, which I've edited. Is that bad of me? I'm editing Charles Masterman.
Lightly editing.
Yeah, well, he's basically, in this particular early part of the book, it's called The Spirit of the People, and he's basically saying, if you look at the character or what defines the character of England at the time of writing, it's that of the middle classes. It's the outlook of the old school middle classes. And he said, but there are other voices, which he talks about the multitude, where now we could still talk about this, and talk about the 80%. And I think a lot of this chimes now in what's happened with how we talk about post-Brexit England, how we talk about people being censored and not having a voice. It's all relevant. So this is how he begins. And below this large kingdom, which for more than half a century has stood for England, stretches a huge and unexplored region which seems destined in the next half century to progress towards articulate voice and to demand an increase in power. It is the class of which Matthew Arnold, with the agreeable insolence of his habitual attitude, declared himself to be the discoverer, and to which he gave the name of the populace. To most observers from the classes above, this is the deluge, and its attainment of power, if such attainment ever were realised, the coming of the twilight of the gods. They see our civilization as a little patch of redeemed land in the wilderness, preserved as by a miracle from one decade to another. They behold the influx as the rush of a bank holiday crowd upon some tranquil garden, tearing up the flowers by the roots, reeling in drunken merriment on the grass plots, strewing the pleasant landscape with torn paper and broken bottles. It's a class full of sentiment which the foreigner is apt to condemn as sentimentality. Next to this sentimentality, so astonishing to Europe because so irrational, comes the invincible patience of the English workman. He will endure almost anything in silence until it becomes unendurable. When he is vocal, it is pretty certain that things have become unendurable. And this is England, an England which has learnt more than all other peoples the secret of acquiescence, of toleration, of settling down and making the best of things in a world on the whole desirable. But an England also of a determination unshaken by the vicissitudes of purpose and time, with a certain ruthlessness about the means when it has accepted the end, and with a patience which is perhaps more terrible in its silence than the violence of a conspicuous despair. Read in my best head girl voice, I feel.
That's wonderful. Michael Collins, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been Between the Lines.